Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I welcome you here to the University of North Florida. I'm Nancy Bronner. I'm the Executive Director of OneJax, and we appreciate you being here with us for an evening of civil discourse. I'd like to recognize the partners of the Civil Discourse Project, the Florida Times Union, and Frank Denton. There's Frank, the editor of the Florida Times Union. WJCT, oh, yes. WJCT Public Broadcasting, Michael Boylan sends his regards. He's out of town. The Jacksonville Human Rights Commission, Charlene Taylor-Hill. And the UNF President's Office and OneJax. Together, we welcome you tonight. I'd like to also take a moment, if I could ask the members of the OneJax Board, Senior Advisory, and Founders Circle to all stand and let us show appreciation for your leadership. So I'm delighted to tell you about tonight's program. Several years ago, we began our local Civil Discourse Project here in Jacksonville, which was modeled in part after the National Institute for Civil Discourse. From our series of civil discourse programs, many of you have attended over the last few years, we've learned that civil discourse has nothing to do with the silencing of certain views or with abridgment of First Amendment rights. Rather, civil discourse implies a willingness to explain the reasons behind one's opinions, to listen carefully, and try to understand differing viewpoints. Civil discourse can exist, and in fact is especially important during times of increased political polarization. Tonight we're honored to have as our guest speaker the Executive Director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer, and I'm going to introduce her in just a moment. But first I want to tell you just a bit about the National Institute, and she'll tell you quite a bit more. The National Institute for Civil Discourse, NICD, was established in May of 2011 after the tragic Tucson shooting that killed 6 people and wounded 13 others, including former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. All were participating in a Congress on Your Corner event, a fundamental act of democracy. In response to the tragedy, the Tucson community came together to create NICD, a nonpartisan organization based at the University of Arizona that would promote healthy and civil political debate. NICD is devoted to the same principles that motivated Congresswoman Giffords, that people with different values and political preferences can discuss their differences in a civil and productive manner. Ironically, just days before the shooting, Representative Giffords had begun discussions about the possibility of setting up a center to study how to improve the quality of civil conversation. NICD is proud to be leading this work. Informed by research, NICD's programs are designed to create opportunities for elected officials, the media, and the public to engage different voices respectfully and take responsibility for the quality of our public discourse and effectiveness of our democratic institutions. The National Advisory Board includes former Presidents Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush, former Senators Tom Daschle and Olympia Snowe, former Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and Colin Powell, and former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. And now I'm very pleased to tell you more about our guest speaker, Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer. Dr. Lukensmeyer leads the NICD, working to reduce political dysfunction and incivility in our political system. As a leader in the field of deliberative democracy, She works to restore our democracy to reflect the intended vision of our founding fathers. Dr. Lukensmeyer previously served as founder and president of America Speaks, an award-winning nonprofit organization that promoted nonpartisan initiatives to engage citizens and leaders through the development of innovative public policy tools and strategies. During her tenure, America Speaks engaged more than 165,000 people and hosted events across all 50 states and throughout the world. Dr. Lukensmeyer formerly served as consultant to the White House Chief of Staff from 1993 to 1994 and on the National Performance Review, where she steered internal management and oversaw government-wide reforms. She was Chief of Staff to Ohio Governor Richard Celeste from 1986 to 1991, becoming the first woman to serve in that capacity. She earned her PhD in organizational behavior from Case Western Reserve University and has completed postgraduate training at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland. Excuse me. And before I bring Dr. Lukensmeyer up, I need to tell you a programming change. President John Delaney is at this moment at the hospital with his mother and is unable to be with us tonight. This happened just in the last couple of hours. So we appreciate the flexibility of all of us, especially Dr. Lukensmeyer, as we adjust our program to accommodate this absence. And on social media, I'd like to tell you that we invite you to post pictures, videos, or quotes from tonight's event. And please share these on our social media pages. Our Facebook page is at OneJax UNF. Our Twitter handle is at OneJax. And hashtags to use are hashtag OneJax, hashtag Civil Discourse. So with that, I am delighted to bring up Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I'm pleased and honored to be with you here this evening and very grateful to OneJax and the University of Northern Florida to have invited me to spend the evening with you. This is actually my first visit to Jacksonville, Florida, and I certainly hope not my last. I actually couldn't help but think as I was flying in today that Jacksonville was one of the far too many communities that has had to absorb significant destruction from a natural disaster in the last months. And looked in the whole range of things, you of course were a pretty fortunate community. But the bottom line is, today the California wildfires, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Houston, Mississippi, and Ireland got into it today as well. It actually made me stop and think for a moment about the heart of what we will be talking about tonight. In many ways is how important it is that at this particular time in our political cultural history, when we are experiencing such extraordinary divides driving our politics and such extraordinary incivility dominating our culture, that part of our task is the absolute necessity of once again connecting as human beings and seeing each other not as the labels we all carry, but seeing one another as one community that has been blessed to live in this country with an extraordinarily strong foundation, which has been shaken some in the past few decades. And I'm surprised that this was what I'm moved to do, but I'm going to take a moment, because I think the natural disasters that we've all gone through, and my guess is people in this community, in this room, know some of the people who were harmed the most here in Jacksonville. But I'm actually going to ask us to take just a moment of silence to actually recognize the real onslaught the human community is experiencing from natural disasters and, frankly, from political incivility and dysfunction. Thank you. When I first took this position, which was a little over 5 years ago, no matter who I talked to or where I went, whether that was an audience like yourselves in a community in the United States, or an editorial board at a newspaper, or someplace on Capitol Hill, the pushback always was, well, what is civility anyway? How do you define civility? Isn't that just requiring everybody to be polite? And of course, we had good responses to that were well thought out and interesting. But what a sea change just 5 years later. No one ever asks me anymore what the definition of civility is. You can't look at any media, whether that's on the internet or the radio or television or print today, without seeing and hearing some story, usually on the negative side, in terms of how we are treating one another as people, how our politicians are treating one another. So civility has become a common parlance. And as is always the case in culture, when something becomes common parlance, it also becomes part of our comedy. So we have a collection at NICD of political cartoons about civility. This happens to be my personal favorite. I think it kind of captures civil discourse on a gurney on the way to the emergency room with the clear question of, will it make it or won't it? So I want to share with you some data about what we as Americans think about the answer to that question. Weber Shandrick, which is the second largest communications media PR firm in the world, 7 years ago, the CEO was a bit prescient. And he decided to institute, not for a client, but just because he thought it was important data for the country, what is now called the Annual Survey of Civility in America. So this data is baseline at this point. I put the URL up there because some of you want to look at all this data, and I'm sure Nancy will put this PowerPoint on OneJax so everybody will have it. But the bottom line is, in their last year's data, which was published in January, as you can see on the screen, 79% of us thought the 2016 presidential election was uncivil at a level we had never seen before. 69% believe we have a major civility problem, and 75% of us believe that incivility in America is a crisis. One other data point I probably should add to my slide is that 72% of us, almost exactly the same number, believe that the way in which we are playing out this incivility in our politics, in our communities, is actually reducing our respect in the world. So red states, blue states, Republicans, Democrats, this data is from everybody. So people are understanding that the time has come to face up to this and ask ourselves the questions, not only how did we get here, but what can we do about it? Pew, more recently, I believe this was in March, if I remember right, decided to take to the field a poll about what experience Americans were having talking to each other about their opinions of that election, who won, who lost, etc., and what was it like to try to have that conversation. And as you can see, 59% say it was stressful, only 35% say it was interesting and informative. Further on in this poll, one of the questions they always ask is Democrats and Republicans' views of each other, and we are strengthening and rigidifying our judgments of each other as Americans by virtue of what party we are members of. And something that showed up in the data for the very first time ever is a lot of us expressed that we would have hesitancy to have our daughter or our son marry someone from the other political party. This has gotten pretty serious in terms of the judgments we are making of one another, because the indication of that is it isn't only about your party identity, but in some ways a suggestion that if my daughter were to marry your son, somehow he's not quite up to what our family stands for, or you can fill in however it would be said in your family. I want to remind us, you're going to have to excuse me, I'm clearly coming down with a head cold, and I'm going to have to hydrate pretty frequently here tonight. I want to remind us, democracy is fundamentally a conversation. Democracy has always had serious conflicts in it. It's an ever-continuing process. There's not a time when we somehow finish the discussion on immigration or finish the discussion on tax reform. We are in a continuous conversation by change in context, change in circumstances, to come to a new agreement about who we are as a people and what we want as a country. But one of the important thoughts I want to leave you with tonight, the quality of that conversation really matters. And we've come to a place now where many of us aren't even willing to have the conversation anymore. That's dangerous. I've chosen this particular graphic. I live in Washington, D.C. Fairfax County has had one of the highest ranked public education systems, K through 12, for literally decades. It's also a very demographically diverse community. This story, and I'm sure each of you have your own story like this, but this one seared me in a way I will never forget. 2 or 3 days after, during the election cycle in 2016, when the first real attacks on the Muslim community began to happen by candidates running for the presidency of the United States, at third grade recess at this Fairfax elementary school, little white children were seen taunting little brown children, saying things like, "If Trump's elected, you won't be here anymore." Kids model what they see adults do. I've heard real stress from parents around talking about, how do I manage, I want my child to understand what it means to be a citizen, I want them to pay attention to the election, but I don't want them to pay attention to how candidates behaved in this election. So we need to take seriously the legacy that we are leaving, not just for us, but for our children and our grandchildren. If you take nothing else away from what I talk about tonight, I hope this particular couple of concepts stick. It's easy to forget. We're such a culture that focuses on independence and individual achievement. It's very easy to forget that at our essence, human beings are truly social beings. We profoundly respond to the structure we're in, the context we're in, and the signals that we're receiving in that context and structure. In terms of how important this is for civil discourse and how we talk to each other, I'm just going to share one example that every one of you knows half of the story, and maybe lots of you know the other half of the story. The first photo I'm going to show you is in Richmond, Virginia, where the mayor, city council, and education and faith leaders brought to the community beginning about 8 months ago, a real conversation about what should happen to the Confederate statues in Richmond, Virginia. And as is true in many communities in the country, there were people who were adamantly for keeping the statues exactly where they sit in Richmond, and there were people who were adamantly saying, these statues were put up here during Reconstruction for the wrong reasons and should be removed. No violence. No white supremacist group chose to go to Richmond. The community had a context and a structure and a set of processes for holding a profoundly difficult discussion that is going to continue in the country. During the same time frame, Charlottesville happened. A community which had not done anything proactive about what would happen, and there were some sides that had been publicly out there, one side or the other, without community leadership stepping into that, either university or city. And I don't say that to criticize those people. I say that to make a very important point. Context matters. People's behavior responds to context. It's not an accident that Charlottesville was the community that was chosen for that march, for those demonstrations. When that happened, our advisory board, which Nancy told you we're very blessed to have an extraordinary group of people all across the ideological spectrum who've been public servants or media professionals for their entire careers, sent a joint statement. We do this now at the request of the board when something crosses a line, either in civil discourse or something about a fundamental moral issue. NICD is completely nonpartisan. We do not take a position on any kind of issue. But out of concern of where we are headed or where we have come to as a country, our board feels that at certain critical moments, they need to make a statement. This isn't okay in a democracy. We really have to call on leadership of both parties, equally importantly, to change their language and behavior. I'm going to tell you a little bit. Nancy did such a great job of giving the context of NICD. Fundamentally, we work with three different groups. We work with elected officials, we work with the public, and we worked with media and journalism. Our view is that in a healthy democracy, the ability for these three institutions in our country to work together more positively than not is solidly in place. And in fact, the amount of trust existing between these three institutions is a level that means they can effectively work together. So over the course of time, we've developed programs with all three of these groups. I am delighted and proud to tell you that in the time I have, there's no way I could tell you all the programs we're doing. So I'm going to highlight a couple that have been going on long enough that there's a track record. They've been evaluated by outside sources, and we're delighted to say they are having an impact. We started out because of who Gabby Giffords was. She was highly known when she was in the Arizona State Legislature for her bipartisanship, both in the way she developed her friendships and colleagues and in the way she passed bills. She took the same behavior into Congress. So we started out working in the House of Representatives to honor her. We had a working group for a working Congress. It was chaired by Emanuel Cleaver, a longtime member from Kansas City, Missouri, and Kay Granger, a longtime member from Fort Worth, Texas. There were 13 members. You'd know most of their names if I said them, and we were set up to begin working in committees in Congress, to actually have the committee get together, say how are we going to treat each other, how are we going to treat the public in public hearings. We were well down the road, and then leadership literally cut the knees out from under the project, would not support it. So we shifted our work to work in state legislatures. And we did that because a Republican senator from the state of Iowa and a Democratic House member from Ohio came to us. And they said, look, the trend we're now seeing is that big super PAC money is coming into our states, big swing states, important swing states, and are intentionally trying to create the same kind of hyper-partisanship in the state legislature that has had Congress gridlocked for a decade already. Most members in our House and Senate don't want that to happen, and we think if we could provide them a context and a structure, that we could see something different in state legislatures. I'm thrilled to tell you we built a course called Building Trust Through Civil Discourse. We have 3 requirements before we go into a state. First of all, we learned from what we experienced on the Hill. We don't go unless leadership agrees to support it. We don't go unless it's approximately the same number of Republicans and Democrats, although in some legislatures there's a way majority of one party or the other, so it just has to be proportional. And we don't go unless there's a commitment for at least some staff support for implementing the actions that come out of the workshop. You can see by this map, we've now worked in the orange states pretty deeply in 15 states. We've been back several of these states. We've now literally trained every member of the legislature. The yellow states are ones that we're in conversation with. Florida happens to be one of those states. And these are just a few photos of the kind of work that we do with them. One thing that I understood very quickly, being an elected official is a very tough role in our culture. And frankly, most elected officials have pretty bad experiences with us, the public, in the same way us, the public, has some pretty disappointing experiences of our elected officials. So the misunderstanding, the expectation of negativity is pretty heavy on both sides. And we understood that if, in fact, the facilitators of these workshops were members themselves, that the confidence and credibility would happen much more quickly. So, for example, the picture you see in the lower right-hand corner is a professor at the University of Arizona actually doing a facilitator training workshop with members of state legislatures. As of today, we've trained 52 combination Republicans and Democrats. They come from 18 different states. So the last state we did this in was Oregon. And the training team that went to Oregon to work with those legislators came from Vermont, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Nebraska. I'm probably missing one. We also wanted these members to meet each other before they get to Congress. Now, many of you may already know this, but 51% of each new sitting Congress in DC comes straight from state legislature to their chair in the House or the Senate. So our theory of change, if I can say it that way, is that if a cohort group begins to grow that is committed to these principles and understands these practices, and they actually already know each other before they get there, they will have the opportunity to have more of an impact on the culture in the House and Senate than they would otherwise. Something else is probably a little difficult to see here, but I've lived in DC for 23 years, and I have to say this particular act, I'm going to use a word I rarely use, is one of the most radical things I've seen happen in Congress. The 115th Congress that was just seated in January had 52 or 53 new members. 46 of that group signed a commitment to civility, which is a very strong statement. There's no pablum in it whatsoever. You can look at this at the congressional record. About 21 of them gave short speeches about what this means to them, why they did it. And it's 26 Republicans and 16 Democrats, which just about fits the proportion. When we heard about it, we took a look. No media covered this whatsoever. We began to interview these people, and to a person, whether it was a Democrat from the south side of Los Angeles or a Republican from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, every single one of them said they were motivated to do this because the public whose votes they were trying to gain said to them, "We're sick to death of watching candidates character assassinate each other. We're sick to death of nothing getting done on the important issues." So these 46 members have made this commitment. They've done some wonderful things in terms of subcommittee work. They've taken some steps backwards, particularly during the healthcare debate. But I don't know if this pointer works, but the last name on this list is, in fact, your representative, John Rutherford. Now, I don't know John Rutherford. We didn't happen to interview him. I don't know if that's surprising or not surprising. But I would hope that you would congratulate John Rutherford for signing this, and if you see him do something positive, send him that message. They need the attaboys and attagirls. And if he doesn't live up to this civility pledge, I hope you'll send that message as well. Okay. John Q. Wilson is probably the greatest or the most renowned academician in the study of bureaucracy, with the positive use of that word. And I think the importance of this work, both with the public and with elected officials, is we've come to a place where too many citizens actually don't treat government as legitimate. That is a dangerous place for a democracy to find itself. That's a place which leads people to begin to put their trust into authoritarian messages and authoritarian styles of leadership. So we're at a choice point. We've been at it for a while. Structures caused it. We as ordinary people living our lives didn't cause it. Gerrymandering, too much money in politics, primaries that force candidates to their base, all these structural issues brought us to this place. But given that that's happened, this is a democracy. We still make choices ourselves. One of our best forces to begin to reverse this trend, particularly around our language and behavior with each other, is in fact us. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time this evening talking about the Institute's initiative to revive civility and respect. I told Nancy and some of her colleagues earlier, we started this because early on in the primaries in 2016, we got literally thousands of email messages and social media messages with Americans, red states, blue states, purple states. The message was always the same. The verb was a little bit different. I'm ashamed, I'm scared, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. Most of those messages ended with a note of resignation. But what can I do? What can we do? Now, my background involves both some political science and some psychology, and no matter which academic hat I put on, that's not a good place for people to be. If I put my political science hat on, when people have been emotionally impacted by what they see in their context, but they feel no capacity to take an action to impact it, a political science calls it lack of agency. And what are they likely to do? They're likely to withdraw from the public square. If I put my psychologist hat on, same story. What's likely to happen? Because the emotion has been aroused, the emotion has happened. I am exercised about this problem in my community, in my country. I'm likely, again, if I feel no capacity to change it, depending on my personality, depending on the rest of my life, I may well get depressed, or I may well get angry with a kind of diffuse focus of the anger. Does that sound familiar to what we've kind of been watching all over the country? So we decided, we went to our board and we said, we need to do something. We need to actually start an initiative to revive civility, and we began working during the 26 campaign. When I talked to my board about this, given social norms, I don't know why this is true in a culture, and it's not just our culture, but when a social norm is destroyed, it takes a significantly longer period of time to rebuild that social norm than it took to destroy it. So we said to ourselves, we're probably in this at least for a decade and maybe longer. Because we're a unit inside the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona, there's a limit to our resources. So our strategy was to pick 4 states in which we would really invest as much resource as we could. We would build tools, discussion guides, materials, coaching for how to organize a meeting, coaching for how to facilitate a meeting. We would put all of that information up on a completely accessible website. So we're going to work in these 4 states deeply, but anybody, any organization, any person in the country who wanted to take this initiative into their community, their church, their Rotary Club, could do that, and we'll provide a little coaching. I think I don't have this in my slides, so this is one you should write down. We've now put all of these tools and materials not only on our own website, which I know Nancy was great about putting out with this lecture, but we actually created an independent website, www.revivecivility.org. So let's say OneJax decides to hold some of these conversations using the tools that we've helped create. OneJax can go up on that website, can put a dot, can put a marker into Jacksonville, can do a short description of what they're doing, which means any other organization in the country that wanted to could get in touch with Nancy to say, how'd that work? What'd you learn? Did it work? How many people did you get? So that whole idea is to make that website a record of wherever this takes place and make it completely accessible to anyone who wants to use it. When you have a web-based strategy, what is the only way to get it diffused into the culture? It's to have tons of tons and tons of partners. Sorry. So our partners range from AARP to 4-H clubs, universities, institutes like this one, and the goal is to have them be part of how the materials are distributed. Arizona, we started in first because the mayor of Tucson, Mayor Rothschild, responding to some things in the community, came to us and said, I want to declare May as the month to revive civility in Tucson, or Civility Month. And we went about working with him, and he ended up with about 27 partner organizations, ranging from the Council of Churches, Rayathon, the biggest employer, schools, health organizations, all of whom committed to hold some civility workshops during the month of May, and to continue it in the year. Now, for this to work, for this to be important, we need people who are not already thinking the same thing, but who actually did vote for one candidate or the other candidate, or who actually does want the wall built, doesn't want the wall built. So very often what we found, and in Arizona, it was churches that led the way. So a very liberal church in a particular place on River Road approached a very conservative church in the barrio, and those two churches together came to actually use these tools to work across the divides. Mayor Rothschild gave us a great idea. We went to the U.S. Conference of Mayors because some mayors heard what he was doing and came to us. So in June, the U.S. Conference of Mayors passed a resolution. These 22 mayors signed on saying, we're going to do this, and we're inviting mayors all over the country to actually join us. So that's become a very important distribution channel. We'd be delighted to work with your mayor if he decided that he wanted to do this. Ohio, we launched in June. One of our big breakthroughs in Ohio is the Ohio Humanities Council, which already does conversations in communities all over Ohio, is going to take these materials and make it the centerpiece of their work in 2018. Rotary clubs also picked it up in Ohio, which has now given us a connection to national Rotary clubs. And one that surprised us, but when I thought about it, didn't really. I gave a speech to an association of public health officials, all Ohio-based. And little did I know when I started the speech, public health officials have now declared that incivility is a community symptom that needs work. So that's another infrastructure that is out there. I'm telling you all this because when we see this and when we hear the stories through national media, whichever channel you listen to, mostly all you hear is the way the degradation is continuing. I hope one of the messages that you take out of my time with you tonight is people and organizations all over this country, when they are given something positive to do in a structured environment that makes it safe to do it, people are coming to this in droves. Not everybody. Not everybody. There's definitely about an equal number of people on the far right and far left who are utterly committed that their positions are morally superior to everything one side or the other of the center. And in those cases, they're not interested in this discussion. Some of my long-term friends from my own political background say to me, this is wonderful what you're doing, but I don't want to talk to them. So, you know, and I'm sure you may have a person or two you don't want to talk to. So, but our message is, for what's going on in our country, for what's going on in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our houses of faith, for a long time we don't need to worry about those 10% on one side or the other. There's still 80% of us that are having some difficulty with this. The stories we still hear. In a Maine workshop that I did in late August, parents came to me really almost in tears saying, we have 2 daughters. They have not spoken to one another since the election. I don't think I've said this yet tonight, but one of the things that we have to take seriously, this isn't business as usual. This is not something common. Political historians, whether they're on the right or the left, agree that the last time this kind of division amongst us, the people, the vilifying, demonizing, and hating each other 10 months after the election was over has not happened in this country since Reconstruction. If you think about it, we went through not in any way this tough an election and the ugliness of the language, but 2000 was an election that was very, I'm in Florida for God's sakes. What can I say? Some people still hold you responsible for a lot. But the bottom line is the outcome was the same. Popular vote went one way, electoral vote went the other way. I never heard a person, there were a lot of Gore voters who had antipathy for George W. Bush for his whole 8 years. I never heard a person, and I was working in Washington, I never heard a person say they hated a Bush voter. That's what's different this time around. And it's going both ways. It's like we've somehow chosen to think of you, if you voted for the other person, as somehow less moral, less human than those of us who chose the better way. That's what's really dangerous about where we are. I'm going to tell you one more story about Maine, and I don't know if I'm okay? Okay. So we just launched in Maine literally last Friday. But the first workshop we did was in a little town that I happen to know well on the coast. It's Damariscotta, Maine. Has year-round guests of probably about 1,500 people. And I did with that audience something that I'm actually going to do with you in a few minutes, where I asked people to have a conversation with someone that they might likely not talk to. Or here you're just going to maybe think of someone like that. But it turned out, not known to me ahead of time, the chairman of the Lincoln County Republicans and the chairman of the Lincoln County Democrats were both in that room. And on their own initiative, they chose each other as partners in this exercise that I'm going to invite you to be part of. And they agreed during that exercise to have lunch the next week. I don't know if people, well, there's a lot of Maine, Florida half and half, so a lot of you may be a little bit aware of Maine politics. Maine had a governor that likes to think of himself as Trump before Trump, and it's been some pretty ugly stuff in that state. So their expectation about the 2018 election coming up is it's going to be pretty ugly. These two county chairmen went to lunch the next week after this workshop, and they agreed together that they were going to work with their committees to try to develop a set of standards that they would put out for candidates to hold to and campaign ads to hold to during the 2018 election. We're going to meet with those two chair about 6 weeks from now when they've worked out their standards. And what we're going to do at NICD is invite them to say, well, what about the other 15 counties in Maine? A bit of an advantage to be a lower population, smaller number of counties, but for sure. Why not have a discussion with some other county chairs and see if this could spread? So what we're looking to when we're doing these conversations, and it doesn't happen for everyone by any means, but it's that aha moment. What could I do in my circle of influence that actually could make a difference in terms of how people are holding each other across these divides? The critical skill that we all have to come back to is how to listen to one another purely for the purpose of understanding. Why did my life experience bring me to the place that this is the choice I made in the voting booth? And why did your life experience bring you to the place that you made that choice in the voting booth? And it's never to try to convince the other. And here's the trick. You know, one of the things about us as physical beings is when I have a reaction to what you say, something happens. My breath might change, my heartbeat might go quicker, I might want to say, oh, you've got to be kidding me, whatever. But you know what that is in yourself. You know exactly the moment it happens. So what we're asking people to do in these difficult conversations, again, the two of us are just going to try to understand why we each made the choice we made. And it may not be about the vote. It may be about how come our church isn't talking to each other since then, or whatever you choose. That the other job, besides listening, is each time you feel that reaction, each time you know that you want to attack or that you know you want to combat, you make one of two choices. You just say more. Say more. Or ask another question. So what you end up with is more information about why I made the choice I made. No illusion that this is going to mean you come out agreeing with one another. But I can guarantee you, if you really do what I just said with someone who holds a completely different view than you do on something important that you both care about, you will leave that conversation in a different emotional state about that person than you entered it. That's the goal of reviving civility and respect. Okay, Matt, I need your help. I am going to show you a 4-minute video on YouTube. I'll give you just a tad of background. This was made by 2 people in the state of Iowa. Some of you may remember Iowa was one of the first states in the union to actually legalize gay marriage. It then went all the way in challenges to the Supreme Court, which upheld it. Then a whole lot of PAC money came into the state and unseated the 3 judges that voted for it. So huge antipathy. I'm sure you have your own history in Jacksonville about how that issue has evolved over time. The 2 people you're going to see in this video, the woman, Donna Redwing, is the foremost gay advocates' right for 30 years in Iowa, highly respected nationwide. The man, Bob Vanderplaat, runs something called Family Leadership. And just to say how far apart they are on the issue of what gayness means and what should happen, he was Ted Cruz's policy chair during Cruz's presidential election. Please join me in watching.
Well, a friend of mine passed away, and she was all about reconciliation, always about reaching out to people, and to unlikely people. When she passed away, I wanted to do something to honor her. And I thought, who would be the most unlikely person on the planet that I would reach out to? And it was Bob.
I'm the president and CEO of the Family Leader. And our mission statement is to strengthen families by inspiring Christ-like leadership in the home, the church, and government.
I'm the executive director at One Iowa, which is the state's largest lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender organization. I've been an activist and an advocate and sometimes an agitator in this movement for almost 30 years.
Well, Donna and I, we see the world very differently. And our view on marriage, on sexuality, and probably on a lot of other issues.
I guess you'd have to say that my impression of Bob was not only he was the opposition, he was the enemy.
I've probably made statements about her and her organization in the press. She's probably made statements about me and my organization in the press. We weren't natural allies. We weren't natural coffee buddies. And so she emailed the Family Leader and said, hey, I talked to Bob, and Bob said he'd be willing to do coffee. Let me know a good time and date. And so they shared that email with me like, is this true? I mean, is this real? And I said, yeah, it's real, but I never thought she'd follow up on it.
I never thought that he would respond.
And so we set a date to have coffee.
And that was the beginning of this amazing journey. I remember walking in just being very nervous. I had no idea what to expect, none at all.
Well, you know, the skeptic in me thought she would have an agenda, and she probably thought I might have an agenda. But as soon as we sat down, I thought, she doesn't have an agenda. She just wants to get to know who I am. And that really compelled me to say, I should want to get to know who she is.
I think when people have the courage to show you who they are, something happens. And so what surprised me about Bob was his humanity. He's an incredible dad. I also found him to be really funny, and I didn't expect that at all. But we laugh a lot.
Donna's a very good person. She's a passionate person. She has advocated for her issues tirelessly for over 3 decades. So regardless if I agree or disagree with her on the issues, I have a tremendous respect for her.
For a long time, I've been really tired of the hate and the aggression and the kind of snarkiness. We can disagree without being disagreeable. We can fight the good fight in the court of public opinion, but we don't have to hurt each other. That's, I think, the big takeaway for me. We don't have to hurt each other, because when we do that, we're hurting ourselves. We get coffee about once every couple of months.
And I think with Donna, her and I readily assessed that we have a lot of common interest. We have some common ground. The only regret in all of that is that I wasn't the one to ask her out for coffee. And she's the one who asked me out. And I'm glad she did, but I kind of feel like I should have.
What surprised me was, not that he liked me. I thought, yeah, he'd like me. What surprised me was I really liked him.
It hasn't changed my beliefs. It may have changed my approach, because when we do put out a press release, when we do make a public statement, many times I think, I wonder how Donna will view this.
Here's the deal. If Bob and I can have coffee, if we can tell stories and laugh and get to know each other, if we can like each other, then I think almost anyone can find that person in their life, and maybe they can reach out their hand and invite them in.
So here's what I want to ask you to do, if we have a few minutes to do it. I want you to actually think of someone in your life, not necessarily anyone here, but someone in your life where you know there's been a fracture. And there's been a fracture specifically in this last period that we've gone through in terms of this degradation of our language in politics and even our behavior in politics. And think about, what would the risk-reward be if you were to approach that person to try to have this kind of conversation? So just take a minute yourself, and who is that person? What would the reward be if it worked? And what's the risk in asking, and maybe it won't work? Everybody got somebody? I could see a couple of you got more than one pretty quickly, actually. Anyway, here's what I'd like to ask you to do for just, it'll be 5 minutes or less. We usually come to these things with somebody we know pretty well. So I would say you might turn to the row behind you, just so you're talking to someone you don't know so well. And you're just going to have like 2.5 minutes apiece. And you can leave the person nameless, but just to share. What's the circumstance? What's the risk? What's the reward? And you might get an idea from the other person that would make it a little safer and more likely to be on the reward side than the risk side. Does that make sense? Jump in. It'll be quick, but my guess is you'll learn something. I'm fine, but I'm afraid I've gone way over time.
No, we've still got a half an hour. So we can do
So I'll finish up with just a few slides after this that just close it out, and then very few, like 3.
We'd rather listen to you than listen to us.
No, I think the plan is a good one.
Okay.
You want us to put
Yeah.
the chairs up, I'll put the chairs up there
Okay.
now, so we don't have to do that.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
I think the opening question I'm going to ask you is, I think you would agree with this, talk about the inspiring stories you've shared, but I think you might agree that incivility is profitable. And what about the tension between?
Great question.
So that's probably
Great
where we'll
question.
start.
Great question. I hate to do this to you, but if you haven't switched to the second person, you should switch. If you haven't switched, you should switch. I could tell. I was almost going to scold him. So, folks, I hate to do this to you, but if I can ask you to put your attention back. If we had more time, we'd take a couple more steps, but just as a quick show of hands. So in just that 5 minutes, how many of you got some idea or thought about a way to approach this conversation that was new, that you hadn't thought of before? So take a look around the room. It's well over half of you. Okay, I'm going to spend just a few more minutes being completely practical about how you can get involved in this initiative to revive civility. And then Nancy and Kyle are going to join me here, and we'll have some Q&A. So the materials we've created are really 4 ways to engage. You can do it one-on-one, like we just did a taste of here. We have materials that are for small group discussions. Literally, it could be 4 or 5 people, 10 people, 12 people. We actually have the capacity to do pretty large-scale conversations in communities if a community wanted to do that. And a platform that we have found very successful that we first used on mental health discussions after the Newtown shooting of slaughter of elementary kids, called Text Talk, and it's now Revive Civility. Here's another place you should make a note, because you can try this out at home. What we decided was, where do people hang out in their devices, particularly young people? It's their phones, and what are they mostly doing is texting. So we built a software package called Text Talk, and then the script can change. It can be Text Talk Police Community Relations, Text Talk Vote, but now it's Text Talk Civility. So if you go to your text function and text 89800 into your phone, 89800, and type civility in the message line. It will take you to the script that's a back-end on a computer, and essentially your phone becomes the facilitator of a small group discussion. We've written curriculum for junior high schools, for high schools. A lot of teachers are using this in their classrooms. We've now been asked to do it for elementary schools. We haven't accomplished that yet. But this is something you could do in a church group, in a Rotary group. It's a very easy thing to do, and you don't need a leader much to help you. That just shows you what the first screen looks like. Each time you then get a command about what to put into the message line to go on to the next question. So what we're hoping, what we hope we are stimulating, is that literally over the next few years it will end up being millions of Americans. But to start, we've set a pretty ambitious number for ourselves that by November 2018, at least 100,000 Americans someplace in the country, but particularly in these 4 states, will have engaged in one of these conversations that came to an action that you'll put up on the website. First, we invite you to go to the website and actually sign a pledge for civility yourself. That is really easy to do, but we hope you'll read it and be sincere about it and have a way of tracking yourself. Then we're asking you to engage other people, sometimes elected officials, sometimes just other citizens. And those of you who get very excited about this in your own sphere of influence, you could organize a community discussion, which we won't be there to hold your hand, but we're happy to be coaching via phone or web. So, take it yourself, do a living room conversation, recruit organizations to get involved, and any of you who want to be facilitators of this conversation, we're really going to set up a national network of facilitators. I want to go back to the concept of sphere of influence. For what's going on in the country, we all need to do this where we live, where we work, to deal with the quality of the conversation in our democracy about the critical policy issues facing our country. At the moment, we're not getting the leadership to do this, so we need to be doing it ourselves. Alex de Tocqueville, we probably all read it sometime. It was written in 1837. I get a big kick out of looking at it once about every 10 years, and many pages in it you could think were written literally about today. Some things about media, it's just like it was written today. But to me, one of his favorite quotes that I think applies to our time at the moment is an active belief. The greatness of America lies not just in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults. And finally, one of my own heroes, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead. Thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Carolyn, thank you so much. We needed that, didn't we? So you'll notice that it takes 2 people to replace John Delaney. So be patient with us as we try to substitute for John. What we're going to do right now, you've been handed an index card when you came in. If you have a question that you would like to pose to Dr. Lukensmeyer,
Carolyn's fine.
We have staff members around the room. Just hold your card up. They'll come pick it up and bring it up, and we'll keep this process going for a little while. So thank you, really, once again. And so Kyle, you want to?
So Carolyn, thank you for your inspiring stories and what's happening in our country. But certainly, because of your work, there are a lot of headwinds that you're pushing against. And I would think one of those would be that incivility is profitable in many segments of our society and media. Talk about that tension and how you see that being resolved.
That's actually a great question, Kyle. And I think the place that is most clearly visible to all of us all the time is in media. And the internet and threatened the business model, particularly of print. The 24/7 media cycle means now a natural disaster happens and a governor or mayor has to say something brilliant 2 seconds after it happens. We used to have some time to reflect. So that is one institution in the culture in which there is profit in showing incivility on a continuous basis. I think most of us experience that there's not much we can do about that, but I'm going to tell two things that I think matter. Even last year during the election, one of the things we actually taught people as an action they could take when you see this happen on your television station, or when you see something in an editorial or a lead story in your newspaper, we actually just walk people through the skills of how do you call a producer on a television show to actually express that you do not find it acceptable that he or she treated that candidate the way they did, or whatever it was you saw. So again, I think most of us, the way our lives are, we are so busy, we have so many responsibilities, we see these things that we want to stand up against, and we assume there's nothing we can do. And what we've found is if enough people in a community make that call to that producer enough times, it matters. A larger story that, again, I invite people to look at, go to the website called Ohio Voices. In 2016, 14 media outlets, people in Ohio, I lived in Ohio for 24 years. Ohio, as you all know, nobody's ever won the presidency without winning Ohio. Hundreds of millions of dollars drop into that state every presidential cycle at the end. Everybody hates it, except the television stations that are making the money. So 14 media outlets agreed to cover the 2016 election differently. They started with a poll. They called it citizen-centric journalism. And they started with a poll that was taken by the Ray Bliss Institute at the University of Akron. And the questions were, what do you, the public, want to hear about immigration? What do you, the public, want to hear about the opiate? Whatever the issues were. So whether it was an editorial board or a Sunday morning talk show or an internet blogger, the outlets that agreed, when the candidates came to town, they actually would not take any of their conversation about their predetermined positions until they'd answered questions that the public wanted answered. This was so successful, it's now up to 27 outlets, and they have continued this. They have a big grant from the Knight Foundation, so you can track this. It's called Ohio Voices.
Great. So in a somewhat related question, we have that discussions, letters to editors, and other social media abound with false premise discussions, which stops civil discussion when one person refuses to admit or recognize the context is false, leading to anger. How can this be addressed?
Again, I think this is one of the most, I started to say frightening, and I don't like to say that because I feel like we're all being driven into fear all the time. But we have moved away from treating facts as the basis on which we should be having our policy discussions. And I think social media is probably the worst, but we're also actually seeing now very prominent people, including the White House presidency and communications people, literally put out alternative facts, which any one of us could actually go verify or not verify. So I think this, one of the things, and this is a long-term strategy, but I think one of the things that's really necessary is to introduce media literacy into our schools. And I think it needs to start in elementary school. A lot of dictatorial regimes around the world, particularly in South America, have actually had good curriculum in media literacy for decades. We could learn from them. I think when you're in that argument yourself with another person, I actually don't think there's any way you can influence it if you've tried 2 or 3 ways. And I think it's best, I don't usually say this, but I think it's best just to leave the discussion.
Okay. So I was remiss in not telling you who this gentleman is. This is Kyle Reese. Dr. Reese is the senior pastor of Hendricks Avenue Baptist Church and is the immediate past chair of OneJax. So thank you for being up here with us.
Can I say one other thing about the media?
Please.
This is one of the issues, the sort of leaving facts and now behaving as if truth is a situational concept. This is one of the things that major U.S. foundations are most concerned about. Pierre Omidyar, who runs the Omidyar Network, has put literally, in the last 10 months, $100 million into investment in journalistic experiments to see what can be done about this. He's not the only one by any means, but that just is a very dramatic investment. So I think this is one that we, maybe staying attuned to where that's happening. Solutions Journalism is another website you can go to that deals with this issue, but this is a very tough one for ordinary people.
And when you think about that, that's also been called the power of the personal narrative. So it doesn't matter if it happened or not, but it could have happened, and that's good enough for me. So how do people get drawn out of that personal narrative into a larger scope of truth or the reality of the situation?
You know, Kyle, when you asked me that question, as you mentioned, Nancy, I led an organization for 18 years called America Speaks. And we designed very large-scale public forums on tough issues, Social Security, debt and deficit. And the last one we did was 2010. You may remember that was the hottest issue in the 2020 election. It's part of what tipped the scales and who's in the House of Representatives. And 3,500 Americans, all demographically representative, 19 cities across the country, spent 7 hours with the task of taking $25 trillion out of the debt by 2025. Philadelphia was our main broadcast site. I know this is a long response, but you see why I'm going there. When we arrived that morning, there were many people protesting outside the site. They had been sent there by certain organizations that had a certain position that wasn't factual. We actually had some community organizers. Number one, everything stayed calm, and as the day proceeded, we just continued to invite them to come in and join a table for a conversation. When they changed the context, they were no longer carrying a sign, they were no longer carrying their talking points from these organizations. They sat down at a table where they had 2 workbooks in front of them that they could see had been signed off on by some of the most respectable conservative organizations in the country. They sat down and they participated.
Carolyn, there's a counter quote to the de Tocqueville statement from Faulkner, and this is paraphrased. You don't love your country in spite of its faults. You love it because of its faults. Would you like to comment about that?
I'm going to take a deep breath. I actually agree that some of our faults I do love our country about. And I think we are now living in an era where there's some faults that you don't love your country about and that you have to take a stand about. But I think it's true. I mean, think in your own life, not just our country, but people you love. If you really love them, at some point you come to appreciate their quirks and their faults, and that's who they are.
Okay, I'm reading as fast as I can. You say to seek out a variety of reliable news sources. When you have CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and the New York Times, ... I need help.
Another deep breath. I think 2 things to pay attention to. And I know some quarters in the country also accuse what I'm about to say of having a bent, but I think it's hard to prove that. I think good old PBS and NPR are real sources of places to go to trust the facts that you hear and to hear them without bias. And we all should be supporting them. The other place to go in the time that we're in, the things that you care the most about, issues you care the most about, identify an expert in that field, a blogger in that field, who you follow. So you actually know this is a trusted source on climate change. This is a trusted source on tax reform. Now, in a part, I have to flip side say, this is part of the problem. People following trusted sources that aren't putting out factual information. But I take the question how it was intended. I think we really have to put a little effort into identifying where can we find the sources of material that we really want to know.
Carolyn, you have talked about university campuses in a previous gathering this evening. So this question, you can take it in whatever direction you'd like. What could be done to create civility among the protesters listening to the white supremacists on UF campus this weekend?
Well, I don't know this campus circumstance, but clearly this is another example. Probably Berkeley is the one that has had the most pain, the home of free speech movement in the United States of America, having dealt with several, both speakers who actually showed up and threats of speakers showing up. The way we talk about it at the Institute, which I think has been useful on some college campuses, that the issue of civil discourse and the issue of protest, both are long traditions in a healthy democracy that have walked side one another through some very, very tough eras. And civil discourse should never be used as a reason to stop protest. In fact, students on some campuses actually have a phrase for this when an administrator tries to do this, which is to say you have to be completely civil during your protest, is called it tone policing. And I think that's a real issue. So civil discourse has to stand on its own 2 feet relative to the discussion of the issues at hand. And if in fact that discussion leaves some other people to feel like I have to protest and the one that's happening is white supremacy, then it is incumbent upon the protesters to do that in a manner that does not violate in terms of violent behavior, that does not violate and treat with indignity people on the other side, but they definitely should be protected for their right to protest. And I know this is very complicated, particularly on university campuses. One thing that has surprised me, and this may be my naivete about not being fully enmeshed in a college campus for many years, but when these speakers, and I'm not talking about white supremacist rallies now, I'm talking about very extreme speakers on one side or the other. Why not invite somebody of the other perspective and do it as a dialogue, as opposed to setting it up to be a single speech, which by definition is going to mean the other side wants to protest. I don't know if anybody's tried that. Seems reasonable.
It does. In the Congress, the problem is not, it seems, incivility. Reports are that congressmen are quite civil to one another. They happily play baseball with one another. The problem is rather the amount of money which corrupts deliberation. So unless we really address that issue, any genuine dialogue seems doomed, does it not?
Well, I think there's wide agreement that there is way too much money in politics. There's no doubt about it. And I can't imagine, this is obviously a personal statement, that the Supreme Court really could have projected the impact of Citizens United. The touchstones I like to use, just because I keep the numbers clear. In 1992, when Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush ran against each other for the presidency, the entire amount of money spent in that presidential campaign by the candidates and the 2 political parties was $93 million. That was in 1992. In 2012 already, when Romney and Obama ran against each other, each of their campaigns spent $1 billion. Wow. And the 501c3s that track this in campaigns say that the total amount of money spent in that presidential campaign was $7 billion. Again, a personal statement. I think that's immoral. Every child in the United States of America could be in a great early education program. You pick your issue. $7 billion. So no disagreement with that. But I do have to respectfully disagree with the statement that behavior in Congress is always civil. There are a lot of examples, particularly in committee structures, both of members, you can watch it on television, being highly disrespectful of each other, or I say even more egregious, being very disrespectful of a member of the public who is in fact testifying in that committee room. So yes, yes, yes to the money problem, but the incivility problem is real.
You've spoken a little bit of this, but this person asked, what role can faith communities play in reviving civility?
Actually, at the National Institute, we highly, highly appreciate and prize our partnerships with faith groups. For one thing, in the United States of America, as our housing patterns have changed and as our communities have changed in terms of where people are comfortable going, faith-based organizations, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, whatever, are one of our few physical infrastructures in a community where people gather on a regular basis. So for an initiative like ours, when we want to reach a lot of people, faith-based communities are extremely important.
You were describing earlier today a community, I can't remember where it is in the country, where the faith community actually led the efforts towards civility.
Actually, it was in Tucson after Mayor Rothschild called for the month of civility. It happened to be several Christian churches picked up the banner right away, and based on different places they lived in Tucson, a community that happened to have a very liberal congregation invited a community from a whole different section of Tucson that happened to have a very conservative, both theology and politics, and said, if we're going to do this, if we just do it in the members of our own congregation, we're not going to get the amount of difference that we really want to get to. So they combined their congregations and paired up across the two congregations.
Cool.
Okay, final question. Statement. Due to the uncivil and toxic character attacks, has this climate made qualified public candidates not run for office to shield themselves and their family from attacks?
Great question. Frankly, one of the most positive things that we're seeing at the state level is that many people, particularly women, are now running for office specifically because of this problem. They actually believe in their own style of leadership, both men and women who are doing this, to say this is unacceptable. This is not who we want to be as a community. I think it's more complicated on the national level, and partly more complicated because of the amount of money that it now takes to actually run at the national level. So the quality that you carry internally about motivation for running, I think shifts pretty dramatically from the local and state level to the national level. But I want to say, as evidenced by what I shared with you about the freshmen who came in this year, obviously they've heard the American public. So I'm not worried that we've come so far that really strong-minded, good-hearted people that care more about the common good than they do about winning the next election are still trying.
We are out of time. I want to just tell you how much it's meant to us, Carolyn, for you to come down here and share your work and inspire us to be a part of the initiative to revive civility.
And the conversation continues tomorrow morning, as Carolyn will be a guest on Melissa Ross's First Coast Connect. So
Before she hops on a plane.
that's right.
Thank you. Thank you.
So So just a couple of closing comments. Each of us here tonight has the opportunity to help revive civility, as Carolyn has shared, and as on the back of your program is the pledge, NICD's pledge to revive civility. You can go to the NICD website to take the pledge, and I hope you do. And you can be a part of local efforts to revive civility by engaging in OneJax programs such as community suppers, our partnership with the Chamber, the Inclusion Series, and our upcoming, stay tuned for the end of this week, release of our living room conversations that we're initiating. So several mechanisms in our own community where you can be in small group discussions, and so we can get to know each other and bridge some of these barriers, create some connections so we can improve our community. And please support our work. We have a lot of work to do to improve our community. You can be a donor like some of the folks here who were introduced as part of our Founders Circle. So you can go to our website to learn more. And the last thing I want to share with you is another opportunity to be in community with each other. On November 16th, we will be having our 100th Interfaith Gratitude Thanksgiving service. In 1918, the rabbi at the temple founded the gratitude service, and we are celebrating our 100th service. So please join us at 6 o'clock on November 16th and be a part of a beautiful opportunity to come together as a community. So again, Carolyn, thank you very much for sharing
My pleasure.
with us tonight.
My
And
pleasure.
thank you all for coming.